Chapter 22 of The Struggles of Brown, Jones, and Robinson by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Wasteful and impetuous sale. There is no position in life in which a man receives so much distinguished attention as when he is bankrupt. A bankrupt, that is, of celebrity. It seems as though he had then realized the legitimate ends of trade, and was brought forth in order that those men might do him honor with whom he had been good enough to have dealings on a large scale. Robinson was at first cowed when he was called upon to see men who were now becoming aware that they would not receive more than 2 shillings 9 in the pound out of all the hundreds that were owed to them. But this feeling very soon wore off, and he found himself laughing and talking with Giles the stationer, and Burrows the printer, and Sloman the official assignee, as though a bankruptcy were an excellent joke, and as though he, as one of the bankrupts, had by far the best of it. These men were about to lose, or rather had lost, large sums of money. But nevertheless they took it all as a matter of course, and were perfectly good-humored. No word of reproach fell from their lips, and when they asked George Robinson to give them the advantage of his recognized talents in drawing up the bills for the sale, they put it to him quite as a favor, and Sloman, the assignee, went so far as to suggest that he should be remunerated for his work. "If I can only be of any service to you," said Robinson modestly. "Of the greatest service," said Mr. Giles. "A tremendous sacrifice, you know, enormous liabilities, unreserved sale, regardless of cost, and all that sort of thing." "Lord bless you," said Mr. Burrows. "Do you think he doesn't understand how to do all that better than you can tell him? You'll draw out the headings of the posters, won't you, Mr. Robinson?" "And put the numbers and figures into the catalogue," suggested Mr. Sloman. "The best way is to put 'em down at about cost price. We find we can generally do 'em at that if we can only get the people to come sharp enough." And then, as the evening had fallen upon them at their labours, they adjourned to the Four Swans opposite, and Robinson was treated to his supper at the expense of his victims. On the next day the house was closed. This was done in order that the goods might be catalogued and prepared for the final sale. The shop would then be again open for a week, and after that there would be an end of Brown, Jones, and Robinson. In spite of the good humour which was shown by those from whom ill humour on such an occasion might have been expected, there was a melancholy about this which was inexpressible. It has been said that there is nothing so exciting in trade as a grand final sacrificial sale, but it is like the last act of a tragedy. It is very good while it lasts, but what is to come after it? Robinson, as he descended into the darkened shop and walked about amidst the lumber that was being dragged forth from the shelves and drawers, felt that he was like Marius on the ruins of Carthage. Here had been the scene of his glory, and then he remembered with what ecstasy he had walked down the shop when the crowd without were anxiously inquiring the fate of Johnson of Manchester. That had been a great triumph. But to what had such triumphs led him? The men and women had gone away to their breakfast, and he was standing there alone, leaning against one of the counters. He heard a slight noise behind him, and turning round saw Mr. Brown, who had crept down from his own room without assistance. It was the first time since his illness that he had left the floor on which he lived, and it had been intended that he should never go into the shop again. "Oh, Mr. Brown, is this prudent?" said he, going up to him that he might give him the assistance of his arm. "I wish to see it all once more, George." "There it is, then. There isn't much to see." But a deal to feel, isn't there, George? A deal to feel. It did look very pretty that day we opened it, very pretty. The colours seem to have got dirty now." "Bright colours will become dull and dirty, Mr. Brown. It's the way of the world. The brighter they are in their brightness, the more dull will they look when the tinsel and gloss are gone." "But we should have painted it again this spring if we'd stopped here." "There are things, Mr. Brown, which one cannot paint again." "Iron and wood you can, or anything of the like of that." "Yes, Mr. Brown, you may repaint iron and wood. But who can restore the faded colours to broken hopes and a bankrupt ambition? You see these arches here, which with so light a span bear the burden of the house above them. So was the span of my heart on that opening day. No weight of labour then seemed to be too much for me. The arches remain and will remain. But as for the human heart—" "Don't, George, don't. It will kill me if I see you down in the mouth." "These will be repainted," continued Robinson, "and other breasts will glow beneath them with hopes as high as those we felt when you and the others stood here to welcome the public. But what artist can ever repaint our aspirations? The soiled columns of these windows will be regilded, and all here will be bright and young again. But for man, when he loses his glory, there is no regilding. Come, Mr. Brown, we will go upstairs. They will be here soon, and this is no place for you now." Then he took him by the hand and led him tenderly to his apartment. There is something inexpressibly melancholy in the idea of bankruptcy in trade, unless, indeed, when it may have been produced by absolute fraud, and in such a form as to allow of the bankrupts going forth with their pockets full. But in an ordinary way I know nothing more sad than the fate of men who have embarked all in a trade venture and have failed. It may be, and probably is, the fact that in almost all such cases the failure is the fault of the bankrupts. But the fault is so generally hidden from their own eyes that they cannot see the justice of their punishment, and is often so occult in its causes that the justice cannot be discerned by any without deep scrutiny. They who have struggled and lost all feel only that they have worked hard and worked in vain, that they have thrown away their money and their energy, and that there is an end now and for ever to those sweet hopes of independence with which they embarked their small boats upon the wide ocean of commerce. The fate of such men is very sad. Of course, we hear of bankrupts who come forth again with renewed glories, and who shine all the brighter in consequence of their temporary obscurity. These are the men who can manage to have themselves repainted and regilded, but their number is not great. One hears of such because they are in their way memorable, and one does not hear of the poor wretches who sink down out of the world, back behind counters, and to menial work in warehouses. Of ordinary bankrupts one hears nothing. They are generally men who, having saved a little with long patience, embark it all and lose it with rapid impotence. They come forward once in their lives with their little ventures, and then retire, never more to be seen or noticed. Of all the shops that are opened year after year in London, not above a half remain in existence for a period of 12 months, and not a half ever afford a livelihood to those who open them. Is not that a matter which ought to fill one with melancholy? On the establishment of every new shop there are the same high hopes, those very hopes with which Brown, Jones, and Robinson commenced their career. It is not that all expect to shine forth upon the world as merchant princes, but all do expect to live upon the fruit of their labour, and to put by that which will make their old age respectable. Alas, alas! Of those who thus hope, how much the larger proportion are doomed to disappointment! The little lots of goods that are bought and brought together with so much pride turn themselves into dust and rubbish. The gloss and gilding wear away, as they wear away also from the heart of the adventurer, and then the small aspirant sinks back into the mass of nothings from whom he had thought to rise. When one thinks of it, it is very sad. But the sadness is not confined to commerce. It is the same at the bar, with the army, and in the church. We see only the few who rise above the waves, and know nothing of the many who are drowned beneath the waters. Perhaps something of all this was in the heart of our friend Robinson as he placed himself at his desk in his little room. Now for this next day or two he would still be somebody in the career of Magenta House. His services were wanted, and therefore, though he was ruined, men smiled on him. But how would it be with him when that sale should be over, and when he would be called upon to leave the premises and walk forth into the street? He was aware now, though he had never so thought of himself before, that in the short days of his prosperity he had taken much upon himself as the member of a prosperous firm. It had never then occurred to him that he had given himself airs because he was Robinson of the house in Bishopsgate Street. But now he bethought himself that he had perhaps done so. How would men treat him when he should no longer be the same Robinson? How had he condescended to Poppins? How had he domineered at the Goose and Gridiron? How had he patronized those who served him in the shop? Men remember these things of themselves quite as quickly as others remember them. Robinson thought of all this now, and almost wished that those visits to Blackfriars Bridge had not been in vain. But nevertheless it behoved him to work. He had promised that he would use his own peculiar skill for the benefit of the creditors, and therefore, shaking himself, as it were, out of his despondency, he buckled himself to his desk. "It is a grand opportunity," he said, as he thought of the task before him, "but my work will be no longer for myself and my partners. The lofty rhyme I still must make, though other hands shall touch the money. So do the bees for others' sake, fill their waxen combs with honey." Then, when he had thus solaced himself with verse, he sat down to his work. There was a mine of wealth before him from which to choose. A tradesman, in preparing the ordinary advertisements of his business, is obliged to remember the morrow. He must not risk everything on one cast of the die. He must be in some degree modest and circumspect, lest he shut himself out from all possibility of rising to a higher note on any future opportunity. But in preparing for a final sacrifice, the artist may give the reins to his imagination, and plunge at once into all the luxuries of the superlative. But to this pleasure there was one drawback. The thing had been done so often that superlatives had lost their value, and it had come to pass that the strongest language sounded impotently in the palled ears of the public. What idea can, in its own nature, be more harrowing to the soul than that of a tremendous sacrifice? But what effect would arise nowadays from advertising a sale under such a heading? Every little milliner about Tottenham Court Road has her tremendous sacrifice when she desires to rid her shelves of ends of ribbons and bits of soiled flowers. No, some other language than this must be devised. A phraseology not only startling but new must be invented in preparing the final sale of the house of Brown, Jones, and Robinson. He threw himself back in his chair, and sat for a while silent, with his finger fixed upon his brow. The first words were everything, and what should be the first words? At last, in a moment, they came to him, and he wrote as follows: "Ruin, ruin, ruin! Wasteful and impetuous sale! At Magenta House, 81 Bishopsgate Street, on March the 5th, and 3 following days, the stock in trade of the bankrupts Brown, Jones, and Robinson, valued at £209,657 15 shillings 3 will be thrown broadcast before the public at the frightful reduction of 75% on the cost price. To acquire the impetus and force necessary for the realization of so vast a property, all goods are quoted for true, honest, bona fide sale at 1/4 the cost price. This is a solemn fact, and one which well merits the earnest attention of every mother of a family in England. The goods are of the first class, and as no attempt in trade has ever hitherto been made of equal magnitude to that of the bankrupts, it may with absolute truth be said that no such opportunity as this has ever yet been afforded to the public of supplying themselves with the richest articles of luxury, at prices which are all but nominal. How will any lady hereafter forgive herself who shall fail to profit by such an opportunity as this? Such was the heading of his bills, and he read and reread the words, not without a glow of pleasure. One can be in love with ruin so long as the excitement lasts. A solemn fact, he repeated to himself, or shall I say a glorious fact? Glorious would do well for the public view of the matter. But as it touches the firm, solemn perhaps is more appropriate. Mother of a family. Shall I say also of every father? I should like to include all, but then the fathers never come, and it would sound loaded. Again he looked at the bill, again read it, and then proceeded to describe with great accuracy on a fly-leaf the dimensions of the paper to be used, the size of the different types, and the adaptation of various colors. "That will do," said he. "I think that will do." But this, which he had now done, though perhaps the most important part of his task, was by no means the most laborious. He had before him various catalogues of the goods, and it remained for him to affix the prices, to describe the qualities, and to put down the amount of each on hand. This was no light task, and he worked hard at it into the middle of the night. But long before that time came he had thrust away from him the inefficient lists with which he had been supplied, and trusted himself wholly to his imagination. So may be seen the inspired schoolmaster who has beneath his hands the wretched verses of a dull pupil. For a while he attempts to reduce to reason and prosody the futile efforts of the scholar, but anon he lays aside in disgust the distasteful task, and turning his eyes upward to the muse who has ever been faithful, he dashes off a few genial lines of warm poetry. The happy juvenile with wondering pen copies the work, and the parent's heart rejoices over the prize which his child has won. So was it now with Robinson. What could he do with a poor gross of hose numbered 7 to 10? Or what with a score or two of middling kids? There were 5 dozen and 9 left of the catechirions. Was he to put down such a number as those in his sacrificial catalogue? For a while he kept these entries before him as a guide which in some sort he might follow at a wide distance. But he found that it was impossible for him to be so guided, even at any distance, and at last he thrust the poor figures from him altogether, and trampled them under his feet. Tablecloths 7 dozen and a half, different sizes. That was the last item he read, and as he pushed it away the following were the words which his fertile pen produced: "The renowned Flemish treble table damasks of Argentine brightness and snow-like purity, with designs of absolute grandeur and artistic perfection of outline. To dine 8 persons, worth £1 8s. 6d. for 7s. 3d. To dine 12, worth £1 8s. 6d. for 10s. To dine 12, worth £1 18s. 6d. for 10s. 11½d. To dine 16, worth £3 19s. 6d. for 19s. 9¼ and so on, at the same rate, to any size which the Epicurean habits of this convivial age can possibly require. Space will not permit us here to give the bill entire, but after this fashion was it framed, and then the final note was as follows: N.B. Many tons weight of first-class table damasks and sheetings, soiled but not otherwise impaired, also of ribbons, gloves, hose, shirts, crinolines, paletots, mantles, shawls, prints, towels, blankets, quilts, and flouncings, will be sold on the first 2 days at buyer's own prices. "There," said he, as he closed down his ink bottle at 3 o'clock in the morning. "That, I suppose, is my last day's work in the house of Brown, Jones, and Robinson. I have worked not for myself, but for others, and I have worked honestly." Then he went home and slept as though he had no trouble on his mind. On the following morning he again was there, and Messrs. Giles, Burrows, and Sloman attended with him. Mr. Brown also and Mr. Jones were present. On this occasion the meeting was held in Mr. Brown's sitting room, and they were all assembled in order that Mr. Robinson might read over the sale list as he had prepared it. Poor Mr. Brown sat in a corner of his old sofa, very silent. Now and again, as some long number or specially magniloquent phrase would strike his ear, he expressed his surprise by a sort of gasp. But throughout the whole morning he did not speak a word as to the business on hand. Jones, for the first few minutes, attempted to criticize, but the authority of Mr. Sloman and the burly aspect of Mr. Giles, the paper dealer, were soon too much for his courage, and he also collapsed into silence. But the 3 gentlemen who were most concerned did not show all that silent acquiescence which George Robinson's painful exertions on their behalf so richly deserved. "Impetuous," said Mr. Sloman. "What does impetuous mean? I never heard tell before of an impetuous sacrifice. Tremendous is the proper word, Mr. Robinson." "Tremendous is not my word," answered Robinson. "And as to the meaning of impetuous—" "It sounds well, I think," said Mr. Burrows, and then they went on. "Broadcast, broadcast," said Mr. Giles. "That means sowing, don't it?" "Exactly," said Robinson. "Have not I sown, and are not you to reap? If you will allow me, I will go on." He did go on, and by degrees got through the whole heading. But there was hardly a word which was not contested. It is all very well for a man to write when he himself is the sole judge of what shall be written, but it is a terrible thing to have to draw up any document for the approval of others. One's choicest words are torn away, one's figures of speech are maltreated, one's stops are misunderstood, and one's very syntax is put to confusion. And then at last whole paragraphs are cashiered as unnecessary. First comes the torture, and then the execution. Come, Wilkins, you have the pen of a ready writer. Prepare for us this document. In such words is the victim addressed by his colleagues. Unhappy Wilkins! He little dreams of the misery before him as he proudly applies himself to his work. But it is beautiful to hear and see, when 2 scribes have been appointed, how at first they praise each other's words, as did Trisitin and Vedius. How gradually each objects to this comma or to that epithet, how from moment to moment their courage will arise, till at last every word that the other has written is foul nonsense and flat blasphemy, till Vedius at last will defy his friend in prose and verse, in Greek and Latin. Robinson on this occasion had no rival, but not the less were his torments very great. "Argentine brightness," said Mr. Giles. "What's Argentine? I don't like Argentine. You'd better put that out, Mr. Robinson." "It's the most effective word in the whole notice," said Robinson, and then he passed on. "Tons weight of towelling," said Mr. Slowman. "That's coming it a little too strong, Mr. Robinson." This was the end of the catalogue. "Gentlemen," said Robinson, rising from his chair, "what little I have been able to do for you in this matter I have done willingly. There is the notice of your sale, drawn out in such language as seems suitable to me. If it answers your purpose, I pray that you will use it. If you can frame one that will do so better, I beg that no regard for my feelings may stand in your way. My only request to you is this, that if my words be used, they may not be changed or garbled." Then, bowing to them all, he left the room. They knew the genius of the man, and the notice afterwards appeared exactly in the form in which Robinson had framed it. End of Chapter 22. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 23 of The Struggles of Brown, Jones, and Robinson by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Farewell. For the 4 appointed days the sale was continued, and it was wondrous to see with what animation the things went off. It seemed as though ladies were desirous of having a souvenir from Magenta House, and that goods could be sold at a higher price under the name of a sacrifice than they would fetch in the ordinary way of trade. "If only we could have done as well," Robinson said to his partner Jones, wishing that, if possible, there might be good humour between them in these last days. "We did do quite as well and better," said Jones, "only the money was thrown away in them horrid advertisements." After that, George Robinson made no further effort to maintain friendly relations with Mr. Jones. "George," said Mr. Brown, "I hope they'll allow me something. They ought, oughtn't they? There wouldn't have been nothing only for my £4,000. Robinson did not take the trouble to explain to him that had he kept his £4,000 out of the way, the creditors would not now have any lost money to lament. Robinson was careful to raise no hopes by his answer, but nevertheless he resolved that when the sale was over he would do his best. On the 5th day, when the shop had been well nigh cleared of all the goods, the premises themselves were sold. Brown, Jones, and Robinson had taken them on a term of years, and the lease with all the improvements was put up to auction. When we say that the price which the property fetched exceeded the whole sum spent for external and internal decorations, including the magenta paint and the plate glass, we feel that the highest possible testimony is given to the taste and talent displayed by the firm. It was immediately after this that application was made to the creditors on behalf of Mr. Brown. "He brought £4,000 into the business," said Robinson, "and now he hasn't a penny of his own." "And we have none of us got a penny," whined out Mr. Jones, who was standing by. "Mr. Jones and I are young, and can earn our bread," said Robinson. "But that old man must go into the workhouse if you do not feel it possible to do something for him." "And so must my poor babbies," said Jones. "As to work, I ain't fit for it." But he was soon interrupted, and made to understand that he might think himself lucky if he were not made to disgorge that which he already possessed. As to Mr. Brown, the creditors, with much generosity, agreed that an annuity of 20 shillings a week should be purchased for him out of the proceeds of the sale. "I ain't long for this world, George," he said, when he was told, "and they ought to get it cheap. Put 'em up to that, George, do now." 20 shillings a week was not much for all his wants, but nevertheless he might be more comfortable with that than he had been for many a year, if only his daughter would be kind to him. Alas, alas! Was it within the nature of things that his daughter should be kind? It was on this occasion, when the charitable intention of the creditors was communicated to Mr. Brown by Robinson, that conversation took place to which allusion has been made in the opening chapter of these memoirs. Of course it was necessary that each member of the firm should provide in some way for his future necessities. Mr. Jones had signified his intention of opening a small hairdresser's shop in Gray's Inn Lane. "I was brought up to it once," he said, "and it don't require much ready money." Both Mr. Brown and Robinson knew that he was in possession of money, but it was not now worth their while to say more about this. The fox had made good his prey, and who could say where it was hidden? "And what will you do, George?" asked Mr. Brown. Then it was that Robinson communicated to them the fact that application had been made to him by the editor of a first-class magazine for a written account of the doings of the firm. "I think it may be of advantage to commerce in general," the editor had said with his customary dignity of expression and propriety of demeanour. "I quite agree with you," Robinson had replied, "if only the commercial world of Great Britain can be induced to read the lesson." The editor seemed to think that the commercial world of Great Britain did read the Cornhill Magazine, and an arrangement was quickly made between them. Those who have perused the chapters in question will remember how Robinson yielded when the senior partner pleaded that as they had been partners so long they should still be partners to the end, and how he had yielded again when it was suggested to him that he should receive some assistance in the literary portion of the work. That assistance has been given, and George Robinson hopes that it may have been of advantage. "I suppose we shall see each other sometimes, George?" Maryanne said to him when she came down to his little room to bid him farewell. "I hope we shall, Maryanne." "I don't suppose we shall ever dance together again at the Hall of Harmony." "No, Maryanne, never. That phase of life is for me over. Neither with you nor with any other fair girl shall I again wanton away the flying hours. Life is too precious for that, and the work which falls upon a man's shoulders is too exacting. The Hall of Harmony is for children, Maryanne, for grown children, perhaps, but still for children." "You used to like it, George." "I did, and could again. So could I again stop with longing mouth at the window of that pastry cook whose tarts in early life attracted all my desires. I could again be a boy in everything, did I not recognize the stern necessity which calls me to be a man. I could dance with you still, whirling swiftly round the room to the sweet sound of the music, stretching the hours of delight out to the very dawn, were it not for Adam's doom. In the sweat of my brow must I eat my bread. There is a time for all things, Maryanne, but with me the time for such pastimes as those is gone." "You'll keep company with some other young woman before long, George, and then you'll be less gloomy." "Never. That phase of life is also over. Why should I? To what purpose?" "To be married, of course." "Yes, and become a woman's slave like poor Poppins. or else have my heart torn again with racking jealousy, as it was with you? No, Maryanne, let those plotting creatures link themselves with women whose bodies require comforting, but whose minds never soar. The world must be populated, and therefore let the Briskets marry. I suppose you've heard of him, George? Not a word. La, now, I declare you've no curiosity to inquire about any one. If I was dead and buried to-morrow, I believe you'd never ask a word about me. I would go to your grave, Maryanne, and sit there in silence. Would you now? I hope you won't, all the same. But about Brisket, you remember when that row was, and you were so nigh choking him? Do I remember? Ay, Maryanne. When shall I forget it? It was the last hour of my madness. I never admired you so much as I did then, George. But never mind. That's all done and over now, isn't it? All done and over, said Robinson, mournfully repeating her words. Of course it is. But about Brisket. Immediately after that, the very next day, he went out to Gogham, where he was always going, you know, with that cart of his, to buy sheep. Sheep, indeed. And wasn't it for sheep? No, George. Brisket was the sheep, and there was a little she-wolf that has got him at last into her claws. Brisket is married, George. What? Another Poppins? Ha, ha, ha! We shall not want for children. He has seen his way at last. She was a drover's daughter, and now he's married her and brought her home. A drover's daughter? Well, he says a grazier's, but it's all the same. He never would have done for me, George, never. And I'll tell you more, I don't think I ever saw the man as would. I should have taken either of you, I was so knocked about among 'em. But I should have made you miserable, whichever it was. It's a consolation to me when I think of that. And it was a consolation also to him. He had loved her very dearly. He had been almost mad for love of her. But yet he had always known that had he won her, she would have made him miserable. There was consolation in that when he thought of his loss. Then at last he wished her good-bye. And now farewell, Maryanne. Be gentle with that old man. George, she said, as long as he wants me, I'll stick to him. He's never been a good father to me, but if he wants me, I'll stick to him. As to being gentle, it's not in me. I wasn't brought up gentle, and you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Those were the last words she spoke to him, and they had at any rate the merit of truth. And then, before he walked out for the last time from the portals of Magenta House, he bade adieu to his old partner, Mr. Brown. God bless you, George, said the old man. God bless you. Mr. Brown, said he, I cannot part from you without acknowledging that the loss of all your money sits very heavy on my heart. Never think of it, George. But I shall think of it. You were an old man, Mr. Brown, and the money was enough for you, or if you did go into trade again, the old way would have suited you best. Well, George, now you mention it, I think it would. It was the same mistake, Mr. Brown, that we have so often heard of, putting old wine into a new bottle. The bottle is broken and the wine is spilt. For myself, I've learned a lesson, and I am a wiser man. But I'm sorry for you, Mr. Brown. I shall never say a word to blame you, George. As to my principles, that system of commerce which I have advocated, as to that, I am still without a doubt. I am certain of the correctness of my views. Look at Barlywig and his colossal fortune, and £40,000 a year spent in advertising. But then you should have your £40,000 a year. By no means. But the subject is a long one, Mr. Brown, and cannot now be discussed with advantage. This, however, I do feel, that I should not have embarked your little all in such an enterprise. It was enough for you, but to me, with my views, it was nothing, less than nothing. I will begin again with unimpeded wings, and you shall hear of my success. But for your sake, Mr. Brown, I regret what is past." Then he pressed the old man's hand, and went forth from Magenta House. From that day to this present one he has never again entered the door. "And so Brisket is married. Brisket is right. Brisket is a happy man," he said to himself as he walked slowly down the passage by St. Botolph's Church. "Brisket is certainly right. I will go and see Brisket." So he did, and continuing his way along the back of the bank in the narrow street which used to be called Lad Lane. I wish they would not alter the names of the streets. Was it not enough that the Swan with Two Necks should be pulled down, foreshadowing perhaps in its ruin the fate of another bird with two necks from which this one took its emblematic character? And so making his way out into Aldersgate Street. He had never before visited the lairs of Brisket, for Brisket had been his enemy. But Brisket was his enemy no longer, and he walked into the shop with a light foot and a pleasant smile. There, standing at some little distance behind the block, looking with large wondering eyes at the carcasses of the sheep which hung around her, stood a wee little woman, very pretty, with red cheeks and red lips and short, thick, clustering curls. This was the daughter of the grazier from Gogham. "The shopman will be back in a minute," said she. "I ought to be able to do it myself, but I'm rather astray about the things yet a while." Then George Robinson told her who he was. She knew his name well, and gave him her little plump hand in token of greeting. "Laws a mercy, are you George Robinson? I've heard such a deal about you. He's inside, just tidying hisself a bit for dinner. Who do you think there is here, Bill?" And she opened the door leading to the back premises. "Here's George Robinson that you're always so full of." Then he followed her out into a little yard where he found Brisket in the neighbourhood of a pump, smelling strongly of yellow soap, with his sleeves tucked up, and hard at work with a rough towel. "Robinson, my boy," cried he, "I'm glad to see you, and so is Mrs. B. Ain't you, Em'ly?" Whereupon Em'ly said that she was delighted to see Mr. Robinson. "And you're just in time for a tidy bit of roast veal, as you won't see again in a hurry. Fed down at Gogham by Em'ly's mother. I killed it myself with my own hands, didn't I, Em'ly?" Robinson stopped and partook of the viands which were so strongly recommended to him, and then, after dinner, he and Brisket and the bride became very intimate and confidential over a glass of hot brandy and water. "I don't do this kind of thing only when I've got a friend," said Brisket, tapping the tumbler with his spoon. "But I really am glad to see you. I've took a fancy to you now, ever since you went so nigh throttling me. By Jove! Though I began to think it was all up with me, only for Sarah Jane." "But he didn't," said Em'ly, looking first at her great husband, and then at Robinson's slender proportions. "Didn't he, though? But he just did. And what do you think, Em'ly? He wanted me once to sit with him on a barrel of gunpowder." "A barrel of gunpowder?" "And smoke our pipes there, quite comfortable. And then he wanted me to go and fling ourselves into the river. That was uncommon civil, wasn't it? And then he well nigh choked me." "It was all about that young woman," said Em'ly, with a toss of her head. "And from all I can hear tell, she wasn't worth fighting for. As for you, Bill, I wonder at you, so I do." "I thought I saw my way," said Brisket. "It's well for you that you've got somebody near you that will see better now. And as for you, Mr. Robinson, I hope you won't be long in the dumps neither." whereupon he explained to her that he was by no means in the dumps. He had failed in trade, no doubt, but he was now engaged upon a literary work as to which considerable expectation had been raised, and he fully hoped to provide for his humble wants in this way till he should be able to settle himself again to some new commercial enterprise. "It isn't that as she means," said Brisket. "She means about taking a wife. That's all the woman ever thinks of."
"What I was saying is, that as you and Bill were both after her, and as you are both broke with her, and seeing that Bill's provided himself like—"
"And a charming provision he has made," said Robinson. "I did see my way," said Brisket, with much self-content.
"Still, you ought to look elsewhere as well as he," continued Emily. "According to all accounts, you've neither of you lost so very much in not getting Maryanne Brown."
"Maryanne Brown is a handsome young woman," said Robinson.
"Why, she's as red," said Mrs. Brisket. "Quite carroty, they tell me. And as for handsome, Mr. Robinson, handsome is as handsome does. That's what I say. If I had two sweethearts going about talking of gunpowder and throwing themselves into rivers along of me, I'd never forgive myself. So, Mr. Robinson, I hope you'll suit yourself soon. Bill, don't you take any more of that brandy. Don't now, when I tell you not."
Then Robinson rose and took his leave, promising to make future visits to Aldersgate Street. And as Brisket squeezed his hand at parting, all the circumstances of that marriage were explained in a very few words. "She had 300 down, you know, really down. So I said done and done, when I found the money wasn't there with Maryanne. And I think that I've seen my way." Robinson congratulated him, and assured him that he thought that he had seen it very clearly. End of chapter 23. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Chapter 24 of The Struggles of Brown, Jones, and Robinson by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. George Robinson's Dream. George Robinson, though his present wants were provided for by his pen, was by no means disposed to sink into a literary hack. It was by commerce that he desired to shine. It was to trade in the highest sense of the word, that his ambition led him. Down at the Crystal Palace he had stood by the hour together before the statue of the great Cheetham, ominous name, of him who 3 centuries ago had made money by dealing in Manchester goods. Why should not he also have his statue? But then how was he to begin? He had begun and failed. With hopeful words he had declared to Mr. Brown that not on that account was he daunted. But still there was before him the burden of another commencement. Many of us know what it is to have high hopes, and yet to feel from time to time a terrible despondency when the labours come by which those hopes should be realized. Robinson had complained that he was impeded in his flight by Brown and Jones. Those impediments had dropped from him now, and yet he knew not how to proceed upon his course. He walked forth one evening after his daily task, pondering these things as he went. He made his solitary way along the Kingsland Road, through Tottenham, and on to Edmonton, thinking deeply of his future career. What had John Gilpin done that had made him a citizen of renown? Had he advertised? Or had he contented himself simply with standing behind his counter till customers should come to him? In John Gilpin's time the science of advertisement was not born, or, if born, was in its earliest infancy. and yet he had achieved renown. And Cheetham, but probably Cheetham had commenced with a capital. Thus he walked on till he found himself among the fields, those first fields which greet the eye of a Londoner, in which wheat is not grown, but cabbages and carrots for the London market. And here, seating himself upon a gate, he gave his mind up to a close study of the subject. First he took from his pocket a short list which he always carried, and once more read over the names and figures which it bore. Barlywig, £40,000 per annum. How did Barlywig begin such an outlay as that? He knew that Barlywig had, as a boy, walked up to town with 2d. in his pocket, and in his early days had swept out the shop of a shoemaker. The giants of trade all have done that. Then he went on with the list. Holloway, £30,000 per annum. Moses, £10,000. Macassar oil, £10,000. Dr. De Jong, £10,000. What a glorious fraternity! There were many others that followed with figures almost equally stupendous. Revalenta, Arabica, bedsteads, paletos, food for cattle. But then how did these great men begin? He himself had begun with some money in his hand and had failed. As to them, he believed that they had all begun with 2d. As for genius and special talent, it was admitted on all sides that he possessed it. Of that he could feel no doubt, as other men were willing to employ him. "Shall I never enjoy the fruits of my own labour?" said he to himself. "Must I still be as the bee whose honey is robbed from him as soon as made? The lofty rhyme I still must build, though other hands shall touch the money. Will this be my fate for ever? The patient oxen till the furrows, but never eat the generous corn. Shall the corn itself never be my own?" And as he sat there, the words of Poppins came upon his memory. "You advertising chaps never do anything. All that printing never makes the world any richer." At the moment he had laughed down Poppins with absolute scorn. But now, at this solitary moment, he began to reflect whether there might be any wisdom in his young friend's words. "The question has been argued," he continued in his soliloquy, "by the greatest philosopher of the age. A man goes into hats, and in order to force a sale he builds a large cart in the shape of a hat, paints it blue, and has it drawn through the streets. He still finds that his sale is not rapid, and with a view of increasing it, what shall he do? Shall he make his felt hats better, or shall he make his wooden hat bigger? Poppins and the philosopher say that the former plan will make the world the richer, but they do not say that it will sell the greater number of hats. Am I to look after the world? Am I not to look to myself? Is not the world a collection of individuals, all of whom are doing so? Has anything been done for the world by the quixotic aspirations of general philanthropy, at all equal to that which individual enterprise has achieved? Poppins and the philosopher would spend their energies on a good hat. But why? Not that they love the head that is to wear it. The sale would still be their object. They would sell hats, not that the heads of men may be well covered, but that they themselves might live and become rich. To force a sale must be the first duty of a man in trade, and a man's first duty should be all in all to him. If the hats sold from the different marts be not good enough, with whom does the fault rest? Is it not with the customers who purchase them? Am I to protect the man who demands from me a cheap hat? Am I to say, "Sir, here is a cheap hat. It is made of brown paper, and the gum will run from it in the first shower. It will come to pieces when worn, and disgrace you among your female acquaintances by becoming dinged and bulged"? Should I do him any good? he would buy his cheap hat elsewhere, and tell pleasant stories of the madman he had met. The world of purchasers will have cheap articles, and the world of commerce must supply them. The world of purchasers will have their ears tickled, and the world of commerce must tickle them. Of what use is all this about adulteration? If Mrs. Jones will buy her sausages at a lower price per pound than pork fetches in the market, has she a right to complain when some curious doctor makes her understand that her viands have not been supplied exclusively from the pig? She insists on milk at 3 halfpence a quart, but the cow will not produce it. The cow cannot produce it at that price, unless she be aided by the pump, and therefore the pump aids her. If there be dishonesty in this, it is with the purchaser, not with the vendor, with the public, and not with the tradesman. But still, as he sat upon the gate, thus arguing with himself, a dream came over him, a mist of thought, as it were, whispering to him strangely that even yet he might be wrong. He endeavoured to throw it off, shaking himself, as it were, and striving to fix his mind firmly upon his old principles. But it was of no avail. He knew that he was awake, but yet he dreamed, and his dream was to him as a terrible nightmare. What if he were wrong? What if those 2 philosophers had on their side some truth? He would fain be honest if he knew the way. What if those names upon his list were the names of false gods, whose worship would lead him to a hell of swindlers instead of the bright heaven of commercial nobility? Barlywig is in Parliament, he said to himself over and over again in loud tones, striving to answer the spirit of his dream. In Parliament! He sits upon committees. Men jostle to speak to him, and he talks loud among the big ones of the earth. He spends 40,000 a year in his advertisements, and grows incredibly rich by the expenditure. Men and women flock in crowds to his shop. He lives at Albert Gate, in a house big enough for a royal duke, and is the lord of 10,000 acres in Yorkshire. Barlywig cannot have been wrong, let that philosopher philosophize as he will. But still the dream was there, crushing him like a nightmare. "Why don't you produce something so as to make the world richer?" Poppins had said. He knew well what Poppins had meant by making the world richer. If a man invent a Katakarian shirt, he does make the world richer. If it be a good one, he makes it much richer. But the man who simply says that he has done so adds nothing to the world's wealth. His answer had been that it was his work to sell the shirts, and that of the purchaser to buy them. Let each look to his own work. If he could be successful in his selling, then he would have a right to be proud of his success. The world would be best served by close attention on the part of each to his own business. Such had been the arguments with which he had silenced his friend, and contented himself while the excitement of the shop in Bishopsgate Street was continued. But now, as he sat there upon the gate, this dream came upon him, and he began to doubt. Could it be that a man had a double duty, each separate from the other, a duty domestic and private, requiring his devotion and loyalty to his wife, his children, his partners, and himself, and another duty, widely extended in all its bearings, and due to the world in which he lived? Could Poppins have seen this while he was blind? Was a man bound to produce true shirts for the world's benefit, even though he should make no money by doing so, either true shirts or none at all? The evening fell upon him as he still sat there on the gate, and he became very melancholy. "If I have been wrong," he said to himself, "I must give up the fight. I cannot begin again now and learn new precepts. After all that I have done with that old man's money, I cannot now own that I have been wrong, and commence again on a theory taught to me by Poppins. If this be so, then farewell to commerce." And as he said so he dropped from his seat, and leaning over the rail hid his face within his hands. As he stood there, suddenly a sound struck his ears, and he knew that the bells of Edmonton were ringing. The church was distant, but nevertheless the tones came sharp upon him with their clear music. They rang on quickly, loudly, and with articulate voice. Surely there were sounds within those sounds. What was it they were saying to him? He listened for a few seconds, for a minute or two, for 5 minutes, and then his ears and senses had recognized the language. "Turn again, Robinson, Member of Parliament." He heard it so distinctly that his ear would not for a moment abandon the promise. The words could not be mistaken. "Turn again, Robinson, Member of Parliament." Then he did turn, and walked back to London with a trusting heart. End of Chapter 24. End of the Struggles of Brown, Jones, and Robinson, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina.